really dive into my talk, I'd like to kind of know a little bit more about who I'm talking to. And I know a lot of you are from the deck. So who is not from the deck? Well, actually, a lot of you are not from the deck. So tell me what your job title is.
Product manager for mobile apps.
Product manager. Does anyone else have the title of product manager in here? Okay. Someone else, a few people. Someone else give me IT what? Manager. Other IT managers? Wow, okay. Someone else. Matt, your job title now that you have your mouth full of food. Product designer. Other product designers? Okay. I'm not going to try to find out who everybody is, but I think I want to kind of talk a little bit about, I'm a designer, and my specific subset is graphic design. And your professions may be different than mine, but I'm going to guess there's some common threads, and those common threads are how we do what we do. In other words, process. So what I want to talk about today is my own outline of process, but more importantly, I want to talk about a step that I believe we are missing in process, or at the very least, one we are relegating to the subconscious rather than an overtly articulated part of the process. First, I'm going to back up and tell you my story of process evolution. I'm sharing this because I believe it may be somewhat similar to your own journey. I'm not sure how many of you were actually taught a process when you started your job. If you were, great. I wasn't. And also because my own journey helped me to get to my process model that I have today. So for me, it was learning by doing, AKA experiential learning. When I had my first job as a designer, I'll call it an apprenticeship model. Like I said, no one introduced me to process, and I certainly had not been introduced to it in college. It was a little different paradigm in design education. I'm looking at some of my former students here then. And my first job really didn't require me to learn much about process. I was designing a monthly magazine. And that's a pretty clear universe of what needed to be done. However, if I had thought about it, I would have realized that I was, in an abbreviated way, using process. I didn't need to think about the goals and parameters, those were set. But I did need to read the content and look at the images provided before designing. I would call that research. I did sketch out different layouts, explore or ideate. I did create what was called camera-ready art and check the job on press, produce. But I didn't think too much about who were the users. It was an already defined group, or the channel. It was a monthly magazine. I just did my job. So fast forward 4.5 years to my second job as an art director in Kentucky's largest public relations firm. Now I work with a lot of different kind of clients, including Fortune 500 companies, communicating to a lot of different audiences with a lot of different communication needs and different goals, resulting in a lot of different kinds of projects. I needed to work differently than I had when I was handed an editorial package in the world of publication design. I still didn't have anyone specifically teaching me a way to approach my work. And although I had no design mentors, I was working with top-notch PR professionals and was observing how they approached projects, worked on a team, gathered information, and developed an implemented plan. I was learning, assimilating, and creating a process, albeit it was still unarticulated, on my own. So I worked there for 17 years, and I started out as a solo designer. Ultimately, I had a team of about 4 to 5 to 6 designers working with me. The designers I brought on board, like me, learned by experience and observation, because I was not doing anything to articulate a process for how we work through projects. So why do I tell you this? Basically, for the first 20 plus years of my design career, I never really thought much about how I did what I did. What was my process? If someone had asked me that question, I don't think I could have answered it in a clear or articulate way. Now we've arrived at 2002. I was invited to teach at U of L in a newly created designer in residence position. I jumped at the chance, but immediately felt over my head. At the very least, I had a serious case of imposter syndrome. Oh my God, what do I have to offer? What can I teach them? And more importantly, how can I teach them? In that oh shit moment, I sat back and thought, how do I do what I do? What happens from the time I get an assignment to achieving a hopefully successful solution? I basically deconstructed how I've been doing my job for the past 20 years. And that's the first time I think I ever overtly articulated a step-by-step process. I also started reading about teaching design and stumbled upon articles and books about design process. The good news is I discovered I did know what I was doing, I just had never really articulated it. Chris is smiling over there. After some initial attempts at outlining design process and thinking about what I wanted to have happen from the time I gave the students an assignment to the time they finished it, I had my process roadmap of 6 steps. So this was my roadmap circa 2008 when Chris graduated. Research, explore, select what's the best idea from all your sketches and idea development, compose or make, and then refine and produce. So that was my model. Now, my roadmap for process, assuming you all have process in your world, may be very different, and you'll find a myriad of different process outlines out there. In fact, if you really want to dive in and see how others slice and dice process, check out Hugh Dubberly's book, How Do You Design a Compendium of Models. Dubberly's book, which I discovered years ago, has gathered 131 different process models from various fields of design, engineering, software development, education, and from people like Jay Doblin and Nigel Cross, and from major corporations like Apple and organizations like NASA. So have fun looking at that, I do. So back to my own model. I deconstructed what I did, but in my early years of teaching, I rarely presented that process to students. In fact, during the first semester I taught, I just assumed students would intuit process. I basically gave them an assignment with some parameters and a due date maybe 3 to 5 weeks later, and saw what happened. I knew they would need to go through a number of steps to get there. Maybe I even had a few points in the assignment where they might need to show the results of some of those steps, like turning in a creative brief. But mostly they were on their own to block and tackle the assignment. If I didn't require research or a certain number of sketches, many students locked onto their first idea that came to mind and immediately jumped to the computer to start producing it. And by the way, not teaching process plays into that myth that designers are just naturally creative. We just sit down at our computers and in a couple of hours, an amazing design springs forth fully realized. And not teaching it certainly doesn't help young designers learn a method to approach design problem solving. What a disservice. Those who did intuit a bit more about process, did more sketching, more evaluation, more refinement, of course did better. But I wasn't doing much yet to instill process into their way of working, other than putting a few points in the assignment handout that I didn't clearly identify as process steps. Yes, I did an occasional presentation at the beginning of the semester on design process to introduce the concept, and I might have included It's across the top of this semester timeline. That's an earlier process model I used in a semester timeline like this. But that might be occasional or a periodic side note. A lesson I've learned from years of teaching is don't assume, do articulate. There are a lot of things we do pick up on by doing them. Of course, that's experiential learning. But to reinforce that, we need to clearly state our expectations if we want people to get them, whether that's in the student world or in the workplace world. Perhaps you have to hammer it home. I've also learned from teaching that showing something one time isn't enough to instill process, instill anything. People have to practice a skill over and over for it to stick and become a natural part of how they work, whether it's playing baseball, playing an instrument, or solving a design problem. It takes practice to really get good at something. So in my teaching, I feel like I'm not really introducing students to some totally foreign way of working or thinking, but what I am doing is bringing the how they do something to a more conscious, top-of-mind level. Giving them a framework, making that framework the outline for how they move through an assignment so that they can start owning it and incorporating it into their future workflow. Giving them a way to approach any assignment in a systematic way that will get them from point A to point B. So it took me 8 years or so to get another aha moment about how I was teaching process. Maybe I'm a slow learner. I was teaching a new class in our curriculum, Design for Public Issues, where students work on a team with a nonprofit for an entire semester. I told them I didn't know what they were going to be making. This was a very different paradigm from giving an assignment with parameters and expected deliverables. This aha moment happened as I was preparing for that first week of Design for Public Issues class in 2011. So my original plan was we would meet with our nonprofit for a kickoff meeting. But the client couldn't meet during that first class period, so I thought, oh, I've got to come up with something to show the students. And I thought, I'll show them a presentation about process. Since this really would be the model that they would be using from the beginning of the semester to the end, it would be a good idea to go over it so that they didn't just have to figure it out for themselves. So I dusted off my process presentation to show that first day. And that's when I realized some missing steps in my model. I wonder if anybody's going to already guess what these two missing steps are. Problem definition at the front end. I see a nod or two. An evaluation at the back end. These steps would be incredibly important when they were no longer students and they were working professionals. They would need to be the ones asking the questions, discovering the needs, shaping the assignments, defining the problem, along with goals and objectives. And they, in addition to the client, the stakeholders, the users, would need to be the ones to evaluate the success of that solution. So why had I not thought of that before? And I realized this, that in most classes, so we're in the education environment, most classes other than this one, we, the faculty, are defining the problem. And we, the faculty, are also the ones evaluating the outcome. I had articulated a process that was based on an assumption of certain input and expected output. When students were now going to be working directly with clients and determining what the client needed, I realized that my student process model needed revising to be more consistent with a professional practice model. So version 2008, prepared for that first day of class in 2011, now had, 2011 version, had 8 steps. Same steps in the middle, but I basically added those 2. And I still use this process model, and I will tell students, even if I'm defining the problem and I'm going to be evaluating it, that they know that, they understand that, and I put it in there overtly. So I thought I'd finally arrived at a model that I felt pretty darn good about. Of course, I would also point out to the students that even though I've laid it out in this nice, clean, linear fashion, it's not necessarily clean and linear. Sometimes people jump back and forth to different stages. It can be messy, it can be iterative. But no matter what you are doing as a designer, I think you can probably put it in one of these buckets. So like I said, that's the model I've been using since then. But even so, I began to feel like there was something still missing. It's something that we may be doing, but we are not necessarily doing it in a conscious, deliberate way. Without it, process can become a checklist. Okay, check that box, moved on. The awareness of this missing step was based on my observation that students who procrastinated, perhaps they just didn't know how to get started on a project, rushed their work or shortcutted steps in the process, had projects that I considered half-baked. What was missing? Reflection. So what do I mean by reflection? Merriam-Webster's second definition, serious thought or consideration. So what I'm positing is that once we start down the path, we've got our original problem definition, we frequently get caught in the end game. In the deadline-driven, get-it-done, information overload, fast-paced, results-oriented, billable hours world, we forget to allow time to step back and give serious thought or consideration to where we are in a project, where we started from, where we want to go. Are the decisions we made sound, or have we gone off course, but still keep pushing forward on the wrong route towards a destination that may be off target because we haven't bothered to reflect and either confirm our decisions or allowed time to consider a course correction? What if we could achieve better results by allowing time in our projects to stop what we are doing, to step back for an hour at various points to reflect? What if we inserted into our own process or method overtly words like stop, pause, reflect? So my latest and greatest process diagram inserts reflection at every single point. But now I was curious, since it had taken me this long to get to this point in my teaching, was I being oblivious? Was this my own myopia? Did other thinkers about process include reflection in their workflow and I just hadn't noticed? So putting on my research hat, I revisited Dubberly's How Do You Design once again. Did a word search, and I did not find the word reflect or reflection in any one of these 131 models. So I searched for evaluate or evaluation. And while about a dozen of these process models, mind you, a dozen is less than 10%, had evaluation, and typically at the very end of the process, none of it had as a pause inserted frequently in the process. And I believe reflection needs to be inserted in multiple places, literally after every step. Otherwise, we have too many opportunities to go off course. So even with all these models, few people had thought to include, at least overtly, evaluation, much less reflection. Side note here, I do not equate evaluation to reflection. Evaluation is defined as judgment or assessment. To me, that implies a more finished state. While reflection to me is, again, that time for serious thought or consideration. Nor do I equate feedback with reflection. Feedback, whether from users, stakeholders, clients, peers, is certainly valuable and provides many insights. But perhaps we need to reflect on the feedback we receive. I'm also not saying that people who outlined all these models or who use process or anyone in this room who uses process are not doing any reflection, but perhaps it is assumed and not articulated. And I strongly feel that if you want to make sure something is part of the process, you have to state it. Back to don't assume, do it, articulate. So let me give you some examples of how I think reflection can add to your creative work. In this case, these are reflections that I would call sort of accidental or unplanned. So example one is what I'm going to call sleep mode. You design something at the end of the day, or make something at the end of the day. You think it's pretty sweet. I've been there. You look at it the next morning, not so much. So what happened? Your brain took a break and perhaps subconsciously revisited previous steps in the process, in the problem. With some time away, you had a clearer vision of what might be a successful approach, or you more clearly remembered what problem you were trying to solve in the first place. So example two is, instead of sleep mode, it's my active mode. And I've experienced this next phenomenon more times than I can count, to the point where I know I can actually count on it. For me, it's walking or running in the park. So what about that works? Number one, I'm stepping away from my day-to-day environment. Number two, I am not actively working on or thinking about anything, much less a specific problem. Okay, I might be thinking about my knees hurt, it's hot, but I'm not thinking about work-related things. And it lasts, number three, it lasts a certain amount of time. Typically for me, that's 40 to 60 minutes. What I've observed is during this last 5 to 10 minutes, my cooling down phase, where I'm walking the last half mile or so, I'm completely relaxed. Frequently, at that point, an insight or idea literally seems to pop into my head. A thought of, oh, now I know what I'll do for fill in the blank. Oftentimes it might be how I'm going to shape an assignment for my students, or it might be a way to handle a design problem that I'm working on, or it might even be an idea for some completely new project I'd like to do. But it comes with a clarity and a surety that I'm actually onto something. So lesson one is that reflection involves the ability to step away from the problem and let it simmer on the back burner of your brain. This sounds very similar to a theory John Cleese puts forward in a presentation on creativity he gave at the 2009 Creativity World Forum. He said, you need boundaries of time and boundaries of space for your brain to be creative, to play. So for you, perhaps the break is playing a game of ping pong, or eating your lunch at the waterfront, watching the Ohio River flow by, or maybe coming to one of these lunches, a walk on the Big Four Bridge, a long bike ride. Again, from my experience, two things are necessary: enough time and some space. And space means away from your workplace. So lesson two for me is that to really make this work, you must make reflection a habit. Just like learning any new skill, we need to gain muscle memory in making reflection part of our process. So another point I'd like to make, though, is that reflection doesn't have to take a long time. I'm not talking about inserting months of time into your workflow. An hour may be enough time for appropriate reflection, but it's taking enough time to examine again, here's where we are in this project, and to ask questions like, looking back on the previous steps, does this fit? Or looking forward to our goals, are we on the right course? Do we need to revisit our assumptions, get more information, shift gears, or are we in a good place? So, assuming my theory resonates with you, there's a couple of important points I'd like to discuss. Can you make a business case for time that might be considered unproductive? Will upper management see this as bringing value? we need to be able to identify reflection not only as important, but also as a legitimate and valuable part of our process. Just as you might say, we're in the research and discovery phase right now, you could as easily say, we're in the reflection stage right now, and feel comfortable with that. So let's assume you had 100 hours budgeted for a project. What if you were pretty sure that you could build a better project in 90 hours if you were given 10 hours of reflection time? Justice Louis Brandeis, a Louisville native son, subscribed to this principle. One of his famous quotes is, "I can do 12 months' work in 11 months, but not 12. He realized that you have to get away from what you're doing to have perspective on it. So in preparing this talk, I wondered if there was any data to back this up. So I did a quick Google search, searching value of reflection. Jackpot. The third hit in my search was the power of reflection at work. The source, Harvard Business Review. I felt like that would be a pretty good source for the business world. As I read this article and the research study it referenced, I felt validated. Yes, there was data to support this. I can only give the briefest overview of this article today and the study it referenced, but the study was testing the value of reflection using different modes of reflection. In this case, they were primarily written. One at the end of the day for 15 minutes, one between after certain steps. And it was testing how it applied to learning and performing a task or a new job skill. But I feel like you can extrapolate that same kind of idea to what we're doing in process when we're solving a problem, AKA process. So in these two studies, in both studies, participants who reflected performed between 18% and 25% better than the control group that did no reflection. Those are pretty significant numbers. Again, I think you'd have to read the study and go, does this really apply to our world, or is this kind of askew? But I think it's valid. It's my theory and I'm sticking to it. To quote Harvard Business School professor Francesca Gino, who co-authored the paper, "I don't see a lot of organizations that actually encourage employees to reflect or give them time to do it. When we fall behind, even though we're working hard, our response is often just to work harder. But in terms of working smarter, our research suggests that we should take time for reflection." So much like my personal process evolution, where I had to articulate what process was in my world, I'm now finding myself at that same place when it comes to the idea of reflection. My point is, as with anything, if we want to make sure reflection is included, we need to bring it to the top of mind, to make it conscious, deliberate, intentional, and to embed it in how we work, rather than relegating it to happenstance. The other question that may be on your mind is, how does this work when you're working on a team? If you're flying solo, you can insert that pause for reflection at will. If you're working on a team developing a project, and I'm going to guess you all are working on a team, then how does that work? How do you make sure it happens? I would argue that it just needs to be built in, literally put on the agenda. A planned time to step back together as a team to reflect. Perhaps it should be someone's explicit responsibility to call a timeout, just as surgical nurses do this in operating room protocol. And it should be after each process step, not merely at the end of a project. So we've come to the end of my process evolution, or perhaps it's just my current pause in my process evolution. To reiterate, process needs to be articulated and not accidental. If you are a boss bringing someone on board, you need to make sure they understand the process, not hope that they figure it out. Reflection is a critical element missing. Reflection's different than evaluation. It's different than feedback. I argue that it needs to happen at multiple points, and it needs to be deliberate and intentional, literally baked in to your process. And I believe reflection will make your work better. So thank you for letting me take you on my little process journey. And now I'd like to ask you, what do you think? The floor is now open. Okay, Matt.
When you teach reflection in your classes, are you careful about how explicitly you define reflection? Because you said, like, it can be a personal favor to you. It's go walking for an hour in the park or running, but for someone else, they might hate it or whatever it is. How much do you define reflection without leaving it completely up to assumption or whatever?
Okay. Matt's question is how do I do that in the classroom? How do I put that in there? And again, I think it's like idea generation. It works differently for different people. The walking and running is what works for me. You know, sometimes it's like that shower moment, as people call it, or the drive. But the way I include it in the classroom now is virtually, Carl probably had some of this. I know Lilia and Chris did not. They do process journals during the semester in almost every class I teach. And it may not be specifically, okay, now that you're here, think back, where do you want to go, where do you want to be? But they have to reflect about sort of what they're doing. And it's more, you know, that deepening and documenting learning. So it's kind of like this, but it's not necessarily, it's both metacognitive about what am I learning, how am I learning it, as well as a specific project they're working on, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you help them identify a thing? Like, do you tell them, like, oh, for me, it's walking for an hour?
Yeah.
I know it's
Yeah.
a period of time.
I do. You know, it may be listening to certain kind of music. It may be whatever, but I really do, you know, we try to, even in the very first class they take as freshmen, say, allow time to step away from your work because you will see it differently. And I hear it, you know, I got a comment like that in the journal from 205, that first class, as well as I showed some reflection, some refinement on that T Please project that's from juniors. And Elijah, who did that, was talking about, you know, I had my first layout and I thought it was really pretty good. And then I got some feedback, I thought about it, and I realized there was a lot more I could do with it. So that's how that works, at least in my world for now. Other questions, comments? Do you think I'm full of shit, or is this something that resonates? Karen?
Well, it's very interesting to me, and it seems like we used to do more of that, but everything's faster now. So we didn't identify that that's what we were losing as we ramped up. So I'm glad to see it coming back as a...
Right. And again, I don't recall really doing it early on. Like I said, 20 plus years as working as a designer before I started teaching, and I never really thought about it. And I agree that we're in this hamster cage world now, but like I said, I don't think it needs to be a long, long time, but you need to remind yourself, bake it in, as I say. Other thoughts, comments? You're reflecting on it, thinking about it. Do you all, first of all, this is hopefully not putting anybody on the spot, but I know in the deck they have a certain design method, design process that they use. What about other areas? Where you work, your unit within Humana have sort of articulated process models, or, okay. And when you onboard someone, you are teaching them that, I hope. Hopefully, yeah. Again, I didn't do it when I was the boss, when I had people I supervised. It was apprenticeship. You watch, you learn, you observe, you hopefully pick up on things. But I do think it just articulating things. I mean, it's no different than being in a relationship. Okay. Right.
I'm wondering how to distinguish that from what you're talking about
Yeah.
with reflection. Because my people have heard so many times that the retro has become a grotesque now.
Right, and I think that can happen, for sure. I don't know that I have a great answer for that, but I do think groupthink, it's the same as when you have focus groups. One person says something, it's like, oh yeah, I agree with that. So it may be a matter of building in a little time for some solo think and writing, and literally writing down those thoughts. Because then you don't get the group think as much. Then it's like, let's share what each of you are thinking about. What are your concerns? Are we in a good place, or do you have issues with where we are? Yeah, it can, like I said, anything can become a check the box. Let's go. Was lunch good? Anything else?
I think Alexis mentioned last week, there's no tech lunch next week, everyone. We have a GitHub enterprise workshop about nurse sourcing, so sorry. No free lunch next week.
No free lunch. Well, I've enjoyed putting this together because it made me have to think more clearly about what I'm doing. And hopefully it's given you guys a little food for thought. If you have any feedback, Sean's got my email. I'd welcome that. Okay, thank you so much.